This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitzahon, and today we're continuing our War of the Spark full set limited review. We've already looked at white and blue, and today we're looking at black. I use a letter grade system in these videos. If you want to know exactly what those grades mean, there's a link in the description below that will take you to a video that explains how I grade cards in my limited reviews. Alright, now let's get started with our first black card, which is Aid the Fallen. So for one generic and a black, it's a common sorcery, and it says choose one or both. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and return target planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. This is an interesting one. You know, it's the kind of card that only really works in a set that has all these uncommon planeswalkers, so it's not something we've ever seen before, this sort of combined effect of getting back creatures or planeswalkers. I do think if all you can do with it is get a single creature or a single planeswalker, it probably isn't worth playing in most situations. Now, the more bombs you have, the better that this can get, because even if you're just returning one card, if that card's supremely powerful, it doesn't really matter. But generally, for these sorts of effects to make the cut in limited, they need to return two things, like Dead Revels, which we just saw. And while this can never do two creatures, if you were consistently able to get two cards back from your graveyard with it, one walker and one creature, then it is a nice card. Thing is, even in a set with this many walkers, making sure that you get both in your graveyard won't necessarily be easy. I mean, I would guess the average deck probably has 3 planeswalkers, and that probably makes Aid the Fallen the kind of card that only makes the cut if you're desperate, or again, if you have some bomby things going on. I feel like once you get to 5 planeswalkers, this is worth including in your deck. So I'm going to give it a D in your typical deck in the format, and a C in a deck with enough planeswalkers. Next up, we have Banehound, which for 1 black mana is a common Nightmare Hound with lifelink and haste, and it's a 1/1. This is the kind of card new players will overrate because on the surface it seems like a great deal. I mean, you're getting decent stats for what you pay, 1 mana, right? With 2 keyword abilities is tempting. I mean, lifelink and haste, but not really. That's because these 2 particular keyword abilities, lifelink and haste, aren't particularly useful on a 1/1. So that the return on having those 2 keyword abilities really doesn't make this all that much better than having a vanilla 1 mana 1/1. I would say, normally, like, this is a good place to stick an aura because creatures with lifelink are nuts, but there aren't any offensive auras in this set, which is quite odd, but that's how it is, and that makes Banehound even worse than it might be otherwise. I think it's just a D. You don't play it unless you're desperate. Next up, we have Bleeding Edge, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says up to 1 target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn, amass 2. This is a really strong removal spell. It has the potential to be a 2-for-1. In the event you kill 1 X2 with the -2/-2 effect, and use your new army, or larger army, whichever you get, to trade for or block another attacking creature. Even if this doesn't give you a 2-for-1 right away, it probably will in the long run anyway, because it's going to kill something and give you a creature. That makes this premium removal in my book. One thing to keep in mind about minus effects like this too is that you don't need to outright kill the creature, just weaken it enough to die in combat, which, it turns out, also works quite well with a spell that sticks a 2/2 in play. This is a B. It's one of the better uncommons in the entire set. Next up, we have Bolas's Citadel, which for 3 generic and 3 black is a legendary artifact at rare. It says you may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may play the top card of your library. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its converted mana cost rather than paying its mana cost. This is a very weird card, and the kind that will be really difficult to get right, which I think there's more than usual in this set with all the new static ability planeswalkers and the like, but this one is hard to judge. So for 6 mana, it can let you start ripping cards off the top of your library, and you can play them without paying mana, but losing life instead. Also worth noting that this lets you play lands, which you don't have to pay life for. So it is the kind of card that's like Experimental Frenzy, but it's probably going to be worse on average and limited because of the higher mana cost and the fact that you can't keep ripping through spells turn after turn, or your life is going to be in trouble. But a couple of spells you pay life for seems reasonable. Then it has this other crazy ability where you sacrifice 10 non-land permanents. This seems like a bit of a pipe dream in Limited. You don't get 10 non-land permanents out very often in Limited, and sure, there might be a time where your opponent drops this and you're at less than 10 and they have all these permanents and they just kill you, but still, it's not going to happen that much. And yeah, the first part of the card does kind of help the second part happen since it can give you extra cards, which will become extra non-land permanents. I think what keeps this card playable and keeps it from being like in the D range for me is the fact that you can play lands off of it. So you're sort of ripping through your library Courser of Krufix style by playing lands off the top of your library. Obviously, this isn't as good as the Courser, who's also a creature and 4 mana, but I think that part of the card will be good, and when you do see something on top that's worth casting, you can do it. I don't think it's quite a bomb because it's so expensive and awkward to try to use, especially in terms of the sacrifice 10 land permanent abilities. But I do think, despite its high mana cost and the difficulties it has, it's a solid playable, mostly, again, because you can play lands off the top of your library with it, which for me makes it a C. Next up, we have Bond of Revival, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste until your next turn. These types of effects seem to underperform in most formats. It is nice, this one gives haste to your creature, so maybe you get in for some damage right away, but frequently you'll have this and all you can do is bring back like a 2-drop or a 3-drop, and that doesn't make a huge impact. Or worse, you will draw it early when it's really not going to be worth playing. Of course, the upside can be massive, and it certainly gets better in decks with a couple of bombs, something this set has no shortage of. Still, I don't think it is great or anything, but I think it's a solid playable. It just has such high variance that it's hard to give it anything more than a C. Next up, we have Charity Extractor, which for 3 generic and a black is a 1/5 human knight at common with lifelink. Well, this will be an annoying defensive creature to deal with. Not only does it block lots of stuff, it gains life. I think control decks will feel alright about having one of this guy, but I think most decks probably won't play him, and even the control decks aren't exactly ecstatic about him. They'll just play him if they need a way to hold down the ground and don't have one, and I think all of that makes it a C-. Next up, we have Command the Dreadhorde, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It says choose any number of target creature and or planeswalker cards in graveyards. Command the Dreadhorde deals damage to you equal to the total converted mana cost of those cards. Put them onto the battlefield under your control. This is another really interesting card to go along with Bolas's Citadel. Getting back any number of creatures and planeswalkers from any graveyard is incredibly strong, and this could definitely be the kind of card that can be a finishing haymaker if the game is at parity or you're ahead. But if you are low on life, this becomes a problem, essentially a dead card. The good news is that you can control exactly what you bring back and how much life you lose, and I feel like most of the time there will be something you can do with this. Plus, going really low on life is worth it if it means stabilizing your board or winning the game, obviously enough. I think this has its issues, but I think for 6 mana it will do crazy enough stuff frequently enough that you consider first picking this in weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Davriel, Rogue Shadow Mage, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon planeswalker, Davriel. His static ability says at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, Davriel Rogue Shadow Mage deals 2 to them. He then has a loyalty ability, and he starts with 3 loyalty, but his loyalty ability is -1, target player discards a card. Back in the day, I had some fun playing with cards like the Rack, and Davriel makes me a little nostalgic. I think he's pretty hard to judge, though. So if I could pay 3 mana and make my opponent discard 3 up front, that would be a great card. But how about an enchantment that makes my opponent discard, potentially at least, 1 time each turn for 3 turns? Because that's kind of what Davriel is. And then it punishes the opponent for not having cards in their hand, and I think that's a decent card. The fact that on the face of it, Davriel can function as a 3-for-1 makes me interested in him from the start. He does have low loyalty, and if you can't protect him at all, he might be annoying, but at worst, he's going to give you a 1-for-1. Sometimes in the late game, the discard part won't do anything, and that's always a downside about discard spells, but his static ability makes sure you're still going to get some value out of him. A card with 3-for-1 potential is hard for me not to like, so I'm going to give him a C+. Next up, we have Davriel Shadow Fugue, which for 3 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says target player discards 2 cards and loses 2 life. I like Davriel more than I like this. 4 mana to make the opponent discard 2 and lose 2 life is not a great deal. Mind Rot, which makes the opponent discard for 3 mana, is often not good enough to play in Limited, and this costs 1 more and adds a negligible effect. Now, the thing this does have going for it is the fact that even in the late game, if you draw this and your opponent's hand is empty, it does 2 damage, and that's not a great deal, but does make it better than a regular old discard spell. Still, I don't think it is particularly good. Maybe if you end up with a couple of Davriels it gets better. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, we have Deliver Unto Evil, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare sorcery, and it says choose up to 4 target cards in your graveyard. If you control a Bolas Planeswalker, return those cards to your hand. Otherwise, an opponent chooses 2 of them. Leave the chosen cards in your graveyard and put the rest into your hand. Exile Deliver Unto Evil. This seems pretty nice. I mean, 3 mana to get 2 cards back from the yard. Any cards is great. And obviously, that's not quite what this is. since you get to pick your best 4, and then of those 4, your opponent will give you your worst 2. But the fact of the matter is, you're still getting card advantage, and I don't think it will be all that hard to make your opponent have to think really hard about the choices. You're almost never going to have a Bolus. He's mythic rare, so that part of the card isn't going to happen. If it does, it'll be pretty absurd. But most of the time, this is just going to get you back 2 cards. So this has some setup. You have to have a graveyard with some cards in it, so it isn't always going to be a welcome sight in your hand. But in the late game, this is going to be pretty great, and is the kind of card that can pull you ahead or get you back to parity because you trade with a couple creatures and then get them both back. It does require significant setup, and that keeps me from really wanting to take it as early as my first pick, but I think I'd be happy to take this around 4th or 5th pick. In an ideal world, I would get a single copy of this every time I draft black. But, it is rare, so that's probably not going to happen. So, yeah, overall, I think this is a C+. Next, we have Dreadhorde Invasion, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare enchantment. And it says at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and amass 1. And whenever a zombie token you control with power 6 or greater attacks, it gains lifelink until end of turn. This is a cool card. It has drawn Bitter Blossom comparisons, but obviously it isn't quite that good. Bitter Blossom makes evasive creatures and lets you go wide with the fairy tokens. With how Amass works, you can't go wide here. Not really. But I think it is still pretty good. In situations where you're behind, the 1/1 that can chump every turn doesn't hurt, and if the board is at parity or you're ahead, you're going to have a progressively larger army that will eventually start gaining life back that Dreadhorde Invasion initially took from you. Overall, I like this card, and I think it's worth taking with an early pick, even a first pick in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Dreadmalkin, which for 1 black is a 1/1 zombie cat at uncommon, and it has Menace. And it has an activated ability where you can pay 2 generic and a black to sack another creature or planeswalker and put 2 counters on it. A 1-mana 1/1 with Menace isn't usually very good, probably something like a D, maybe lower. However, that activated ability is some serious business, and unlike a lot of these we've seen in recent formats, this one can do it at instant speed. This means that this is going to set up some very difficult situations for your opponent. Menace and an ability like this together is nasty, because there will be times where your opponent has to double block if they want to block it or maybe even to survive. I think people will be afraid of the activation of this, and a lot of times people will just take the 1 damage, and as the game goes on and fodder is around for this thing to eat, it is going to get scary, and eventually your opponent will have to block it. I think this is pretty good. Not thinking I ever want to first pick it, but it's in the upper echelon of the C's, filler, and I think that makes it a C+. Next up, we have Duskmantle Operative, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human rogue at common, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 4 or greater. So this Grizzly Bear can be blocked by big stuff. That seems fine, and is certainly enough to get it above my vanilla Grizzly Bear grade of D+, but not by a whole lot. This is a C-. Its evasive ability just won't matter early, and it won't always matter late either. So most of the time, it's just that Grizzly Bear, and that's not something you're really excited about. Next up, we have the Elder Spell, which for 2 black is a rare sorcery, and it says destroy any number of target planeswalkers. Choose a planeswalker you control. Put 2 loyalty counters on it for each planeswalker destroyed this way. So the nice thing here is that even if you don't have a walker in play, you can use this to kill, a planeswalker or more than 1 planeswalker of your opponents. There are lots of walkers in this set, but even with 20 at uncommon, there are going to be times where your opponent just doesn't have one and this doesn't do anything. That said, I think most decks will have around 3 targets for this, and that probably makes it worth playing in your main 40 cards, but you should be ready to side it out if your opponent doesn't show you a single walker in game 1. If you actually have a walker in play when you use this, it will be hilariously powerful, and that will happen, but not with regularity. Mostly, I think this is just a C. Next up, we have Eternal Taskmaster, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/3 zombie at uncommon. Enters the battlefield tapped, and when it attacks, you can pay 2 generic and a black, and if you do, you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This seems pretty good to me. 2 mana for a 2/3 is already a nice deal in the vanilla test, even coming into play tapped, and the fact that this guy can bring creatures back to your hand from your graveyard is really great too, and something that gives him usefulness all game long. This is the kind of creature that if you can get 1 creature back to your hand, you're already feeling pretty good, but if you can do it more than once, like manage to have him survive the first attack and get another creature back, then you're going to be in serious business. Backing him up with removal and or combat tricks seems especially nasty. Right now, I'm pretty high on him. I'm going to give him a B-, though I can see getting a bit lower on him in the future. He may not work out. I'm not super confident about this B-, but I think that's where I want to start it. Next, we have Finale of Eternity, which for X and 2 black is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says destroy up to 3 target creatures with toughness X or less. If X is 10 or more, return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So here's the black card in the ridiculous Finale cycle. This is great. Though, like all the finales, how good it is depends on how much mana you can pump into X, and in this case, it also depends on what your opponent's board looks like. However, paying 5 to kill 3 creatures with 3 toughness or less, or 6 to kill 3 with 4 toughness or less seems great, and that's not an insane amount of mana. Sometimes just paying 4 total for this will be effective too. Either way, this is easy to get a 3-for-1 with, and like most of the finales, in the late game, you get a bonus effect that just 100% means you win. Will it happen a lot? No. I will probably see someone pay 10 for one of these once. But hey, it is additional upside on an already really strong card. I think this should be treated as premium removal of the highest order, and I think that makes it an A- for me. Next up, we have God Eternal Bantu, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 5/6 zombie god. It's legendary at Mythic Rare. It's got Menace, and when it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice any number of other permanents and then draw that many cards. When it dies, it gets to go 3 cards deep into your library, or if it gets exiled. That's the God clause in this cycle. So, all the gods in this cycle are super strong, and Bantu is no exception. Let's consider how good a 5 mana 5/6 with Menace would already be. I'd say that'd probably be a B or B- at worst, but Bantu comes with so much more power because he's a god. First, he has a very powerful Enter the Battlefield trigger, one that will get more absurd as the game goes on in most cases. But I would say that anytime you play him, you should probably be drawing at least 1 card. Even on turn 5, chuck a land if you have to. The card you draw is almost definitely going to be better. Then, in the late game, as more useless permanents pile up, or creatures you control get enchanted and they're basically not on the battlefield anymore, or planeswalkers you have are almost out of loyalty, well, he just gets sillier. Playing a large evasive threat that reloads your hand is basically the dream in Limited, and that's what this is. Add to that the God clause for cards in this set, the fact that even if he is killed or exiled, he's not going to stay dead, which is particularly good with an Into the Battlefield ability like his, and you're looking at a bona fide bomb, which makes him an A. Next up is Herald of the Dreadhorde, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/2 zombie warrior at common, and when it dies, you amass 2. I like this alright. A 4 mana 3/2 isn't good, obviously, but it can trade with plenty of 4-drops, and if you're trading with this, you're probably going to come out ahead, because then it gives you amass 2. Whether this makes you a 2/2 creature or makes an army you already have bigger, it is a good deal since it is coming in addition to a trade. This seems like a nice common for black, the kind you probably feel fine about having a couple copies of, giving it a C. Next up, we have Kaya's Ghost form, which for 1 black is a common aura, and it says enchant creature or planeswalker you control. When enchanted permanent dies or is put into exile, return that card to the battlefield under your control. I don't see this as being useful most of the time. It is nice that it counts being exiled because it seems like there's a lot of that going around in this set, but still, if it sticks, you do get a nice effect. The creature comes back, or the planeswalker comes back. But for that to really be worth it, you probably need something awesome, or something with a death trigger or into the battlefield trigger. It can also be nice to put on planeswalkers who only have minus abilities, because then it can come back, but most of the time, this is just card selection and not card advantage. You end up losing this to save something, and you just won't always have something worth saving. I think I want to steer clear of this to start the format. I'm giving it a D. Next up, we have Lazotep Behemoth, which for 4 generic and a black is a 5/4 zombie hippo at common. And, that's solid stats. Better than some vanilla stat lines. I think playing one of these is fine. I'm giving him a C-. Next up, we have Lazotep Reaper, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/2 zombie beast at common. And whenever it enters the battlefield, you amass 1. And it's a 1/2. I'm less high on this amass creature than a lot of them, since 2 mana to add 2/3 to the battlefield is an okay deal, but it's not that exciting. I think he's a C-. I think you'll play him a lot, but, he's not going to be incredible, and I think you'll also cut him some of the time. Next up, we have Liliana, Dreadhorde General, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a legendary planeswalker Liliana at Mythic Rare. She starts with 6 loyalty. Her static ability says whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card. She can +1 her loyalty to make a 2/2 black zombie creature token. She can -4 her loyalty to make your opponent sacrifice 2 creatures. And her ultimate says each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each permanent type and sacrifices the rest. Well, if you pay 6 for a planeswalker, you're usually counting on the card being a bomb, and that is what we have here. The best planeswalkers usually can protect themselves in one way or another, either by thinning out the opponent's board or making creature tokens to block. Liliana can do either. If your opponent is going a little too wide, her -4 might be what you have to do immediately, but on a lot of boards, just using her +1 is some serious business. Even if that 2/2 is just chump blocking, her static ability means that it replaces itself with a card in your hand every time you chump block, which in turn can help you do a better job of protecting Liliana and having her be your win condition, because you're more likely to find more creatures to block or maybe a removal spell, and then Liliana can just keep giving you value for the rest of the game. Her ultimate is going to be game-breaking most of the time, and she really stands a chance of getting there. Even if she doesn't, she's going to wreak havoc while she's around and provide you with some zombies. She's a bomb, and I can't imagine there's a whole lot of cards in this set that you want to pick over her. She's an A+. Next up, we have Liliana's Triumph, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says, each opponent sacrifices a creature. If you control a Liliana Planeswalker, each opponent also discards a card. So most edict effects, these sort of sacrifice effects, are probably like a C- in limited. This is because your opponent always gets to make the choice on something like this, and frequently it won't be very impactful, especially in the late game. But when you make it instant speed and only 2 mana, you're getting into some more attractive territory. Being an instant can make it so that you can cast it in response to a creature coming into play, and sometimes that's the best thing to do so that you have a better chance of making your opponent lose their creature. Being 2 mana means you can cast it really early, such as on turn 2 to take down your opponent's 2-drop. It still will not be great on a huge board, but it will still trade for a card most of the time. Since Liliana, as we just saw, is only at Mythic Rare, you're not going to get the additional value of the card very often, probably not ever. But if you do, it will make this card a lot better, but I think it's just a solid C. Next up, we have Massacre Girl, who for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 human assassin at rare. She has Menace, and it says whenever she enters the battlefield, each other creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Whenever a creature dies this turn, each creature other than Massacre Girl gets -1/-1 until end of turn. This is an interesting design, and pretty good. Up front, we're saying a 5 mana 4/4 Menace is probably a C, but she does way more than that. As her name implies, she comes down and massacres stuff. How much stuff? Well, it kind of depends. Basically, if there is the right distribution of toughness on the table, she can just wipe the entire board, as she keeps triggering her whenever a creature dies this turn effect every time one thing dies. So if a 1/1 dies, it happens again. Then all X2s die. Then it happens again, and so forth. Also worth noting that the things don't have to be killed by her into the battlefield ability. If you have the mana to also play a removal spell and you were just short of being able to wipe all your opponent's creatures, you can still make it happen. In general, I think she's incredible. She isn't that far from being a 5 mana 4/4 with Menace that wipes the whole board. I mean, she's not quite there, but she's not that far away from it. I think in plenty of situations she will take down a couple of small creatures, but even if that's all, you're looking at a really strong card. The solid stats attached to that ability are what makes me really happy about her. I think she's a bomb, and I wouldn't hesitate to first pick her, giving her an A-. Next up, we have Ob Nixilis the Hate-Twisted, who's a Planeswalker, Nixilis, for 3 generic and 2 black with 5 loyalty, an uncommon. And his static ability says, whenever an opponent draws a card, Ob Nixilis, the Hate-Twisted, deals 1 damage to that player. And he has a -2 that says, destroy target creature. Its controller draws 2 cards. I think this is a cool design. His static ability will, of course, do damage to your opponent, and then his -2 has a ton of flexibility. In a pinch, you can use it to kill your opponent's creature, though I would say on most boards, letting your opponent draw 2, even if drawing 2 does 2 to them, isn't going to be worth it a lot of the time. But yeah, sometimes that's what he will do. Other times it will let you cash in a creature for cards, especially those that have like a death trigger or a mass or whatever, in which case it's sort of like having sacrifice fodder for Ob Nixilis. And when you do that, drawing 2 cards is probably worth it. And, it is nice too that in some situations you just have to kill something, and he can do that if you need him to, even if he does let your opponent draw 2 cards. That said, he is in no way premium removal, even though he can do it twice, since in the long run you're giving your opponent card advantage. I think he's just a C. Next up, we have Ob Nixilis' Cruelty, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says target creature gets -5 until end of turn. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. Well, this is a really strong common for black. Black always gets a pretty good removal spell at common. This is one of the stronger ones we've seen in a while. 3 mana for -5. -5 is a great deal, especially at instant speed, and especially with the exile clause attached to it. The great thing about this kind of card, too, is that it doesn't have to outright kill a creature to give you value. Like most -X effects, you can set up a block and use it to make your opponent's creature smaller so yours survives in combat. Granted, -5 is going to do the job on its own most of the time, but it is significant upside that you don't necessarily have to outright kill the creature with it. This will be one of the best commons in the set and one of the most first pickable. It's kind of unfortunate for me that Ob Nixilis seems to be torturing a bird or killing a bird in the image, how I feel about birds, so it's a little upsetting that I have to draft this all the time, but I'll get over it because it's really, really strong. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Price of Betrayal, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, remove up to 5 counters from target artifact, creature, planeswalker, or opponent. This set has a lot of +1/+1 counters in it and a lot of planeswalkers with loyalty counters, but I'm not sure either is enough to make Price of Betrayal worth playing in your main 40 cards. There will just be too many times where it does nothing or very little, and that's not the kind of card you want in your deck. Now, there will be opponents who have both 3+ planeswalkers and several cards with a +1/+1 counters, and against them, this will be nice to bring in, and maybe there are enough counters going around for this to avoid being a straight F main board, but I'm going to start it at F for now. I could see maybe it going up to D, but I do think it's like a C out of your sideboard. Next up, we have Shriek Diver, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/1 zombie bird warrior. At common, it's got flying, and you can pay 1 generic to give it haste until end of turn. 3 mana, 2/1s of flying is usually a C-. Adding haste to this does make it a little better, because sometimes that extra 2 hasty damage can make a real difference, but there are a lot of times where it just doesn't. I don't think this gets above that C- level for a 3 mana, 2/1 flyer, which means it's a kind of common that's fine, but you probably don't want more than 1 copy of it in an ideal world, and it's easy enough to cut. Next up, we have Sorin's Thirst, which for 2 black mana is a common instant that says, deal 2 damage to target creature and you gain 2 life. These types of removal spells are always nice. Killing small creatures at instant speed and gaining some life is a pretty good deal. This would be premium, I think, if it weren't for its mana cost, because it's somewhat difficult to make happen, especially in the early game. You really want to cast this early in a lot of cases, when it will be most effective, and hitting double black, even with 10 black sources, isn't really a guarantee early. Obviously, it's still quite good, and it would probably be, like I said, a B- if the cost was 1 black instead. Maybe it would just be a straight up B if it were 1 and a black, but as it is, I think it's just a C+. Next up, we have Spark Harvest, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sack a creature or pay 3 generic and a black, and it says, destroy target creature or planeswalker. So strictly better Bone Splitters seems interesting. Obviously, killing walkers matters more in this format than in any other we've ever seen. It is made a lot better, though, by the fact that you can also pay 5 to destroy a creature or planeswalker if you don't want to sacrifice something. While I sort of feel like neither side on its own is quite premium, I do think that the options it gives you are enough for me to want to first pick this in weaker packs, giving it a B-. Next up, we have Spark Reaper, who for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 zombie at common, and you can pay 3 generic to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker to gain a life and draw a card. A 3 mana 2/3 has somewhat passable stats. It is probably a D or so on its own, but the activated ability here is strong. The fact that you can use it at instant speed, which we don't always get with these effects, is what makes this the most worthwhile, since you can use it in response to removal or to declare a chump block and then use it, getting some serious value. As far as commons go, this seems like a pretty darn good mana sink for ripping through your library in the late game, and with its reasonable stats, it also has viability on turn 3. I think all of that makes this a pretty good common, giving it a C+. Next up, we have Tithe Bearer Giant, who for 5 generic and a black is a 4/5 giant warrior at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and lose 1 life. I'm always a fan of creatures who draw me a card when they enter the battlefield, and that's going to continue here. 6 mana for a 4/5 isn't the greatest stats, but actually he's quite large, and that actually makes it easier to get a 2-for-1 with him than some smaller creatures that draw you cards. There won't be a lot of board states where this body isn't relevant, and even if it isn't, he can dig you deeper to whatever you need to stabilize or win the game. Now, the fact he has 6 mana does make it so you can't just jam as many of these into your deck as possible, like with Elvish Visionary or Blade Juggler and the like. But I think that every time you play a black deck, you probably want one of these. And if you don't have other stuff at the top of your curve, maybe you want 2. It's not quite first pickable, though it could be the kind of card that if this format is slow enough, gets up there. But I'm going to start it at C+. Next up, we have Toll of the Invasion, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. Amass 1. I'm not normally a huge fan of coercion type effects. 3 mana to discard is just overcosted and frequently won't matter, especially as the game gets longer and your opponent has fewer cards in their hand, maybe no cards in their hand, or they're holding onto lands to bluff. You're also going down on mana to hit a card but not develop the board at all. However, this card does fix that last part a little. It does add to the board. Not in any major way, but it does mean that even if you don't hit anything with this or draw it late when your opponent has 0 cards, at least you're either getting a 1/1 or a +1/+1 counter. Still, this isn't especially good and is mostly what I think of as a sideboard card against slower decks to take down their high curve bombs. I think this is a D main board and a C coming out of your sideboard. Next up, we have Unlikely Aid, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. It says target creature gets +2/+0 and gains indestructible till end of turn. This is a quality combat trick. The good combat tricks make it so your creature can win a wide range of combats, and by win I mean survive, and this makes sure that happens. The power boost allows the creature to take down a lot, and the indestructible matters and makes it so you don't lose your creature. Now, this is still a combat trick, a card that has a difficult time ever being above a C for me because they're so situational, and they can be a huge risk since your opponent can blow you out with a 2-for-1 if you're not careful. But this is the kind of combat trick that usually makes the cut in your deck, which makes it a C. Next up, we have Vampire Opportunist, who for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 vampire at common, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 6 generic and a black to drain your opponent for 2. I think this is a decent 2-drop. It has stats that are kind of passable, but it can attack and trade in the early game like most 2-drops, and that's really what you need. Then in the late game, it has some additional value as it can start draining your opponent, at which point it starts to be a very real concern for them. Still, in the mid game, it's not very good, and even late, 7 mana is a lot, so it isn't like this consistently is going to be draining your opponent for 2, but it is a good place to spend your mana if you're flooding out. I think this is a solid C. Next up, we have Vizier of the Scorpions, who for 2 generic and a black is a 1/1 zombie wizard at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you amass 1, and zombie tokens you control have Death Touch. So, if this were a 3-mana 1/1 that made a 1/1 with Death Touch, which is what it will be a significant chunk of the time, what grade would it get? Probably a C+. Of course, the Vizier gets extra value because it also makes your future armies have Death Touch. And if you can keep trading armies for your opponent's stuff and then make a new army, it's going to be pretty nice. Granted, I do think you need a lot of amass to make this at its best, even though the base level of this card seems pretty alright. In the end, I think this will be a fine card for black decks, but not one worth first picking. I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, we have Vraska's Finisher, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 Gorgon Assassin at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. We see this card a lot, and it is always fine, but I think people tend to overrate them because they read it in its ideal scenario where it kills something when it comes into play. That just won't happen as often as you hope. You can't always make it happen. And, a lot of the times this will just be a 3-mana 3/2, with some upside, and sometimes it will be that 2-for-1, but not as often as you think. I think it still gets a solid grade because of that, but I don't think you should treat it as if it's going to be a removal spell all the time, because it won't. I'm giving it a C. Well, that was the last card here in the black set review for War of the Spark. Tomorrow, I'll be back with my set review of all the red cards in the set. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of my War of the Spark set review and War of the Spark draft videos in the not too distant future, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the rest of the set review, there'll be a playlist on the screen in just a couple seconds. Thanks for watching.